I think if she just put her head, she was on a max contract last year. I think if she just put her head down and played, and these two Indiana Fever games did not happen, DiJonai Carrington is on $750K a year. I think because of these two Indiana Fever games, DiJonai Carrington is a $350K a year player. I think she might have cost herself the guts of $1 million based on what she did in these two games.
That is the part that changes this from ordinary trash talk into something much bigger. The argument here isn't simply that DiJonai Carrington had a bad game. It's that 2 games against Indiana may have changed the way people evaluate everything she brings to a team. And later, there's an even more damaging basketball argument, because if what Caitlin Clark did exposed a repeatable weakness in Carrington's defense, then this conversation stops being about reputation and starts becoming about actual value.
All this is that, like, if you watched the game yesterday, she started off really well. She started off real well. And I'm not going to pretend she didn't. The second Caitlin Clark checked into that game, it was like a switch flipped.
Because this is where the night apparently changed. Carrington had actually started well. That's important. If she'd simply been terrible from the opening possession, you could dismiss the entire thing as one rough performance. But according to this breakdown, the shift came after Clark entered the game. Suddenly, the matchup itself became the story, and once that happened, Carrington wasn't just competing against Indiana anymore. Every possession against Clark carried all the baggage from everything that had happened before.
And people, because she has made it her mission to be the anti-Caitlin Clark, because she locked down Caitlin Clark once. She did. She absolutely did. First game of Caitlin Clark's career, Caitlin didn't really know what was going on in the WNBA. And DiJonai Carrington locked.
And that's the history you have to understand. Carrington really did give Clark problems early in Clark's WNBA career. You don't have to rewrite that because of what happened later. Carrington was physical, aggressive, and capable of making Clark uncomfortable. But success in one matchup can become a trap if you start treating that matchup like part of your identity, because now every meeting gets viewed through the same lens. Every defensive possession becomes evidence, every exchange becomes content, every miss gets clipped, every bucket gets clipped. And instead of people judging Carrington over an entire season, they start judging her through one rivalry. That's where this gets dangerous. Because the attention Clark brings is enormous, and if you're going to deliberately step into that spotlight, you'd better understand that the spotlight works both ways. Beat her, and everybody sees it. Get beaten, and everybody sees that too. But the next part is where this went from internet drama to an actual basketball problem.
And the worst part is that she had one of the, she went 3 of 11 from the field after starting out 2 for 3. After Caitlin checked in the game, she went 1 of 8 the rest of the way. She started shooting Dirk fades, fadeaway jumpers, 30-foot.
That's brutal. The numbers presented here are 3 for 11 overall after a 2 for 3 start, meaning Carrington went 1 for 8 the rest of the way after Clark checked in. And forget the personalities for a second. Forget social media. Forget who likes whom. Look at the basketball decision making. If your value comes primarily from defending, running the floor, cutting, creating pressure in transition, and making opportunistic plays, then trying difficult fadeaways and extremely deep threes is moving away from what makes you valuable. That doesn't mean a role player should never attack. Good players have to be aggressive, but there is a difference between attacking an opportunity and trying to manufacture a moment. And that's the uncomfortable question hanging over this entire game. Was Carrington playing the possession, or was she playing the matchup? Because if the answer is the matchup, Chicago pays the price for that. That's why this isn't just another Caitlin Clark controversy. There's a much more interesting question underneath it. What happens when a player becomes so associated with one opponent that the rivalry starts changing how she plays?
The only thing that DiJonai Carrington is a good basketball player. But she is that good defender, gonna run the floor, I'm gonna cut, I'm gonna score. She is in the Lexi Hole mold as a player. That is what she is. She is in the Lexi Hole mold as a player. She decided she wanted to be the main story yesterday. And the Chicago Sky, I'm not gonna say lost because of it, but it didn't help the Chicago Sky win the game.
That comparison explains the issue perfectly. Carrington can be a useful player without being the offensive centerpiece. Those aren't contradictory statements. A strong perimeter defender who runs hard, cuts intelligently, attacks open lanes, and doesn't need 20 shots can help almost anybody. Those players matter because stars need teammates who can affect games without dominating the ball. The problem begins when a player abandons that formula. Chicago didn't need Carrington to prove she could out-Caitlin Clark. They needed her to make winning plays. And this is why the reaction became so harsh. Fans weren't merely watching two players compete, they were watching Carrington through the accumulated history of this matchup. Once the public decides you're the antagonist in somebody else's story, everything gets interpreted through that character. A stare becomes personal, trash talk becomes obsession, a difficult shot becomes an attempt to get attention, a defensive mistake becomes proof that you've been exposed. Some of that is obviously unfair. Basketball players talk, basketball players have rivalries, basketball players get emotional. Carrington shouldn't be expected to become silent just because Clark is more popular. But there is also a responsibility that comes with understanding the environment you're operating in. If you know every Clark matchup is going to be magnified, then discipline becomes even more important. And that's where the conversation about Carrington's future starts getting uncomfortable.
And DiJonai, in my opinion, in terms of like staying in the league and their worth, it's a similar situation to Sophie Cunningham, where they're good players, but they're going to cause minimum one national crisis a year. They're going to be at the center of a national crisis every single year. And DiJonai doesn't shoot 45% from three. She doesn't shoot 45% from three.
Now we're getting to the real stakes. The commentary makes a provocative comparison between Carrington and Sophie Cunningham. Talented players whose value can't be separated entirely from the attention and controversy surrounding them. Whether you agree with that framing or not, teams absolutely evaluate more than a player's highlights. They evaluate fit, role, availability, efficiency, defense, spacing, locker room dynamics, media responsibilities. And, most importantly, how much that player helps them win relative to what they're paying. Carrington's problem is that her margin for error becomes smaller if her offensive efficiency isn't compensating for everything else. A high-level shooter can stretch a defense without touching the ball. Defenders can't abandon her. That gravity itself creates value. Carrington's game is different. Her strongest version is disruptive. She's supposed to make life miserable for opponents, turn defense into transition, slash into space, and punish teams with activity. So if the defense declines and the offense isn't efficient enough to replace that lost value, teams have to ask a very basic question. What exactly are we paying for? That's much more important than whether people are angry on social media, because outrage disappears, roster decisions don't. And there is another piece of this that might matter even more than the percentages. Clark may have shown other teams exactly where to attack.
And then there was this young left back turned left winger called Garrett Bale from Spurs. Maicon was meant to be the best player in the world at his position, and an elite defender, a good attacker, and Garrett Bale ran past him. That's all he did. He just kicked the ball past him and beat him in a sprint and scored a hat-trick in one game and had like 3 assists in another game as Spurs, I think did Spurs win and draw against Inter Milan? And he was meant to be the best. From that point on, every single team put a fast winger on Maicon and just kicked it into space and ran past him. He went from being seen as the best in the world to a liability in 2 weeks.
The Maicon comparison sounds strange until you understand what happened. Maicon was one of the most respected right backs in world football. Then Gareth Bale's speed against him became the story of those famous Tottenham Inter matches. Once an elite player's vulnerability is displayed that dramatically, future opponents don't politely ignore it. They test it again and again. That's how professional sports works. Coaches don't care about your reputation. They care about film. If you're considered an elite defender, but somebody discovers a particular action that consistently creates separation against you, the next coaching staff is going to run a version of that action. Then the next team sees it. Then another team sees it. Eventually, you're not defending an opponent anymore. You're defending the scouting report. And this is why what happened against Clark potentially matters far beyond one night. Not because Clark scored on Carrington. Great offensive players score on great defenders constantly. The real question is how she did it. Was there something structural in Carrington's defensive approach that Clark repeatedly manipulated? If yes, that's a completely different problem.
DiJonai got cooked so badly by Caitlyn that any, and I mean coach worth a damn, will know how to get wide open every single possession when you're being guarded by DiJonai Carrington. Because the way she guarded Caitlyn is the way she guards everybody. She got cooked so badly that any coach worth a damn is going to have a plan of, okay, good guard, if DiJonai's guarding you, this is what you do, you're going to get wide open. You're going to get wide open shots every single time.
That's the strongest basketball claim in this entire argument, and it deserves more scrutiny than all the trash talk. If Carrington consistently guards players using the same aggressive tendencies, then smart offensive teams can use those tendencies against her. Think about what an elite guard wants from an aggressive defender. The defender wants pressure. The offensive player wants predictability. Once you know where pressure is coming from, you can manipulate it, change pace, reject a screen, use the defender's momentum. Force her over an action and stop. Relocate after giving up the ball. Make her chase through multiple screens instead of letting her dictate the possession. Clark is particularly dangerous in those situations because her threat isn't limited to one area of the floor. Give her too much space and she can shoot. Overplay her and she can use the opening to create something for somebody else. That doesn't mean Clark has permanently solved Carrington, and one matchup isn't enough to declare a defender finished. The comparison to Micon is an analogy, not proof that Carrington's career will follow the same trajectory. But once film exists showing a supposedly strong defender repeatedly struggling with a certain type of movement, the burden changes. Now Carrington has to adjust. That's what elite defenders do. They don't simply say, that was one game. They study why it happened. Was the stance too aggressive? Was she opening her hips too early? Was she chasing instead of anticipating? Was she allowing the offensive player to dictate angles? Was she too focused on denying the ball and vulnerable to back cuts or relocations? Those are fixable basketball problems, but you have to recognize them first. And if Carrington spends more energy maintaining the emotional side of this rivalry than evolving from the basketball side of it, then the criticism is going to become harder to dismiss, because the numbers cited next aren't exactly giving her much protection.
Is going to be lower. She's shooting 27% from field, 29% from three. Yeah. So her defense isn't what it was. Her offense isn't there. And not only that, she's going to cause one national crisis a year. And let's be very clear. Tash Cloud was nearly out of the league for being outspoken. Tash Cloud doesn't nearly start a national crisis every single year. She doesn't. And she's way better than DiJonai.
27% from the field and 29% from three are the figures cited in this breakdown. If those numbers accurately represent the stretch being discussed, that's where the conversation becomes much less subjective. A player can survive inefficient offense when she provides exceptional value elsewhere. A defensive specialist doesn't have to score 20 points, but the defense has to remain special. A shooter can survive defensive limitations if opponents are terrified to leave her. A playmaker can survive poor shooting if she's constantly creating efficient offense for everybody else. Every player needs something that forces a coach to say, I need this on the floor. Carrington's pathway has historically been defensive pressure, athleticism, and energy. So imagine you're a front office evaluating her. You're not asking whether she's famous. You're asking whether the version you're getting next season can defend at the level you need, remain within an offensive role, and produce enough efficiency to justify the investment. That's where reputation can actually affect money, but not necessarily in the simplistic way people online describe it. Teams don't generally say, people on Twitter are angry, therefore we're cutting you. They say, what does this player give us? What does she cost? And what complications come with the package? If the production is undeniable, teams tolerate a lot. If the production is replaceable, everything else gets examined more closely. That's the cold reality of professional sports. And that brings us back to the huge money claim from earlier, because this is where we need to separate dramatic commentary from established fact.
I think if she just put her head, she was on a max contract last year. I think if she just put her head down and played, and these two Indiana Fever games did not happen, DiJonai Carrington is on $750K a year. I think because of these two Indiana Fever games, DiJonai Carrington is a $350K a year player. I think she might have cost herself the guts of $1 million based on what she did in these two games. Based on, as mostly what she did in the first game leading into the second game.
The claim that Carrington's value fell from roughly $750,000 to $350,000, or that these games somehow cost her $1 million, is an opinion from the commentator. It isn't an official contract valuation. But the underlying principle is worth discussing. Your perceived market value can move very quickly, and it's not one viral clip doing the damage by itself. It's what that clip causes evaluators to investigate. If you're a front office and you see Carrington struggling against a specific offensive action, you pull the film. If you're considering paying her significant money, you don't just watch the Indiana game. You watch 20 games. You check whether Clark exposed something unique or merely highlighted a weakness that had already been there. You look at whether Carrington can guard multiple positions. You look at her shooting. You look at her finishing. You look at whether she makes quick decisions. You look at whether her defense remains impactful when she's not matched against the opponent's biggest name. Then you ask the most important question of all. Is the player you're buying the player she currently is, or the player her reputation says she is? That's the real danger for Carrington. The word defender can become a reputation long after the actual defensive impact starts changing. We've seen this across every sport. A player makes an all-defensive team, wins an award, becomes known as a stopper, and for years people continue describing that player using the same label even when the film has become more complicated. The reverse happens too. Somebody gets branded as a bad defender early and continues carrying that reputation after improving. Labels are slow. Film isn't, and if Carrington wants to reverse this conversation, arguing about the label won't do it. She has to make the film undeniable again. That's why I don't think the biggest consequence of the Indiana games is that fans dislike her more. Fans already had opinions. The bigger consequence is that everybody now knows exactly what to watch. Every time Carrington gets matched onto an elite movement shooter or dynamic ball handler, people will watch her footwork. Every time she gets screened, they'll watch how she recovers. Every time she gambles, they'll watch what happens behind her. And every time she faces Clark, the matchup will be treated like a referendum. That is exhausting, but it's also the situation she's in. And there's one final layer that explains why this may have become so difficult to escape.
And like even Caitlin Clark, the whole game yesterday, she's trying to like shit talk Caitlin Clark, and Caitlin's just walking past her like, you're really? You? Like Caitlin Clark will shit talk people. And this reminds me almost of the, the scoreboard, where like everything DiJonai was trying to do, Caitlin was just like, really?
That right there is why rivalries become dangerous when one side appears more invested in them than the other. If Carrington talks and Clark responds, you've got a rivalry. If Carrington talks and Clark walks away, the public interpretation changes completely. Now one player looks consumed by the matchup, while the other looks focused on the game. Fair or unfair, perception matters. And Clark has an enormous advantage in that battle because she doesn't need Carrington to create attention around her. Clark is already the center of attention. Carrington has to be careful not to become known primarily through her connection to somebody else. That's the reputation problem. Not that she is outspoken, not that she competes hard, not even that she has exchanged words with Caitlin Clark. The danger is becoming the Caitlin Clark antagonist before being DiJonai Carrington, basketball player, because once that happens, your entire career gets filtered through somebody else's story. You have a great defensive game against another team? It barely travels. You score efficiently? Nice. But then Clark comes to town and suddenly everybody is watching again. That creates a horrible incentive. The matchup that generates the most attention becomes the matchup where you feel the greatest pressure to do something memorable. And memorable isn't always the same thing as winning. That is why those difficult shots matter. That's why the 1-for-8 stretch matters. That's why the defensive possessions matter. If Carrington starts chasing moments because she knows those moments will dominate the conversation, then the attention itself has started affecting the basketball. And that's the point where a rivalry stops helping your brand and starts controlling it.
And the thing is, where it's like, I think with people with Sophie Cunningham, is that Sophie Cunningham this year has probably done similar. Like, Sophie Cunningham's probably was worth $750K coming into this season. I think Sophie Cunningham's lowered her value to maybe $300-400K because as decent as Sophie Cunningham is, she's probably not worth having a national crisis and having to answer questions for her. Unless you're a team like the Fever. So teams are going to get her on the cheap. In a similar...
The Sophie Cunningham comparison adds another wrinkle because it shows the distinction between attention that increases your usefulness and attention that potentially limits your market. Some teams can absorb noise more easily than others. A team already operating under a massive media spotlight may value a player who understands that environment, embraces physical basketball, and isn't afraid of confrontation. Another organization may want the exact opposite. That's why there isn't one universal dollar figure you can attach to controversy. Context matters. If Carrington's basketball fits a roster perfectly, a team isn't going to reject her automatically because of internet arguments. But if two players offer similar basketball value and one comes with fewer distractions, that can become part of the calculation. Again, the answer isn't for Carrington to become a completely different personality. It's to make the basketball value so obvious that the rest becomes secondary. Shoot better, defend smarter, choose your moments, punish teams in transition, become the player opponents hate facing because she destroys actions, not because she's trending after them. There is actually an opportunity hidden inside all this criticism. If everyone believes Clark exposed Carrington, Carrington now knows exactly what opponents are likely to test. That gives her an off-season blueprint. Professional sports careers are full of these moments. A weakness gets exposed and the player either adapts or declines. Great shooters get chased off the line and learn to attack closeouts. Small guards get targeted defensively and learn positioning. Bigs get dragged into pick and rolls and improve their footwork. Defenders who overplay learn when to contain instead of gamble. The scouting report isn't a death sentence, it's an exam, and Carrington gets to decide what the next answer looks like.
Her boat, but like she is costing herself a shit ton of money, and it's all been her own doing. Every bit of it has been her own doing. There's no other way of—
And that's the harshest conclusion of the original argument, that Carrington created much of this situation herself. I think there's a more precise way to say it. She didn't create Caitlin Clark's popularity. She didn't create the enormous attention surrounding Indiana. She didn't create every narrative fans have attached to her, and she certainly doesn't control every interpretation of every physical play, but she does control how she responds. She controls the shots she takes. She controls whether she plays within her strengths. She controls whether the next Clark matchup becomes personal theater or simply another basketball game. And most importantly, she controls what happens when teams attack the defensive weakness this game may have exposed. That's where this story goes next. Because if Carrington responds by becoming more disciplined, more efficient, and more adaptable defensively, this entire stretch can eventually look like one ugly chapter. People forget quickly when you play well. But if the same patterns continue, then every future team has the film. Every future opponent has the blueprint, and every future contract negotiation has another question attached to it. That's why I wouldn't say these two games definitively destroyed DiJonai Carrington's career or permanently erased her value. That's too absolute. What they may have destroyed is the benefit of the doubt. Before, if you called Carrington a high-level defender, plenty of people accepted the label. Now they're going to check. Before, the Clark rivalry could help Carrington because being the player willing to challenge the league's biggest star gave every matchup instant attention. Now the attention carries risk because Clark has produced moments that can be used against Carrington's own reputation. And before, the conversation could remain about personality. Now there are basketball questions sitting underneath it. That's the shift. The loudest part of this story is the trash talk, but the most consequential part is the film. Because social media can embarrass you for 24 hours, film can follow you into the next scouting meeting. And that's why the next time Carrington sees Clark might be one of the most important matchups for her reputation. Does she chase the confrontation again? Does she try to prove something individually? Or does she simplify everything, defend intelligently, take good shots, and force people to talk about her basketball? That's the choice. And I'm curious where you land on this, because there are really two ways to see it. Did Caitlin Clark genuinely expose something that could change how teams value DiJonai Carrington, or has one bad matchup been blown completely out of proportion because of the names involved? Pick a side in the comments, and if you want more breakdowns where we separate the viral drama from what actually happened on the court, like the video and subscribe.